Akram Khater is originally from Lebanon, and I asked for a story, and he said, well, just mention that I was caught stealing oranges by my school principal, and things have gone uphill from then, I assume. But he holds, his BA is in electrical engineering from California State Polytechnic, and then he changed tracks and went to the University of California at Berkeley for an MA and a PhD in history. He works on an evolving, one of the newest and more exciting areas of history, which is social and family history, and he's very much concerned with the modern Middle East and Lebanon in particular. I want to mention just a couple of his many publications. He is the author of Sources in the History of the Middle East and also a book published by the prestigious University of California Press, Inventing Home, Immigration, Gender, and the Making of a Lebanese Middle Class, 1861 to 1921. Okay, he has been awarded a long list of honors, which I will spare you, but his greatest honor in our minds is that he married one of our most beautiful and talented students from our first years here, Jody Stewart, and they are the parents of two beautiful daughters. So, Akram?
Good afternoon. It's a privilege, really, to be standing here. I was just telling Donnelly that every time I get the Bridges magazine, I drool over all the wonderful things you guys get to go to. We wish at NC State to have 1/10 of what you guys get exposed to. So it's really, truly an honor to be here. And actually, I think Donnelly is absolutely right about my largest accomplishment is to snag my wife. And that was before I was baptized. So that was doubly powerful. But, you know. So anyway, it's a privilege to be here. Now, the talk has been kind of mislabeled to a certain extent, so I'm going to try to clarify what I'm going to address today, and then talk a little bit about, in questions and answers, about some of the things that some of you may think I was going to talk about. Originally, the idea was that I was going to address specifically the war that had took place this summer. And I will talk about it a little bit, although really my interest is a bit larger scope. I want to step back a little bit and talk about the Middle East as a whole and talk about the conflict about the Middle East as a whole. And mechanics-wise, I think I would like to talk for about 30 minutes and then open it up for questions and answers, because beyond 30 minutes, I think you'll all be very bored and you'll hear blah, 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 blah. It gets boring after a while. So it'll be more interesting to hear what you have to say, and we'll have a dialogue in that sense. Now, and in terms of what I will address, the way I'm going to structure my talk is really is two parts. One is I'm going to talk about what led us to be here, not in this room, but really in some ways in this room, because otherwise, if there weren't wars, I don't think we would be that much interested in the Middle East. A friend of mine once joked, said, if they grew broccoli in the Middle East, I don't think we would have all this trouble. So oil obviously is important, and the conflict in the Middle East does bring us over and over again to meet and discuss and try to understand. So part of it is to understand history. And again, I have to confess I am a historian, so that's my bias. History is very critical to understanding. But the second part, which I hope will be enlightening a little bit more, is to look at possibilities, how we can change the Middle East to the future, things that we don't really necessarily talk about, hear about, or even discuss very much. We, generally speaking, focus so much on conflict, we have very little time to talk about conflict resolution. So, obviously, to paraphrase Dickens, today in the Middle East, it's the worst of times and the worst of times. There's just no best of times. We are I have to say, at a personal level, it's probably one of the darkest moments, and I suspect those who, like Arnie and Donnelly and everybody else here who has been involved in the Middle East who have been traveled there, I think most of us probably feel that this is about the darkest moment of the region. I don't think I've ever seen a moment like this, and I lived through the Lebanese Civil War myself. So it seems to be desperate in many ways. And this conflict this summer that took place in Lebanon, between Hezbollah, as it's sometimes pronounced, in South Lebanon and Israel, also signifies a very interesting dynamic that has emerged in the Middle East, and that is a stalemate of violence. What I mean by that is that it appears today that we have been simply two people pummeling each other, if you want to take that metaphor, with nobody winning. Nobody seems to have the upper hand in the region, and ultimately what everybody seems to have a recourse to is more and more violence. So in essence, we have reached a moment, both in Iraq and in Lebanon this summer, that it's clearly we have no one who can change the direction. And all people seem to be able to do is to fight a little bit more. Now the question is why? How did we get to this point? How did it get to this radically violent moment. Now, the Middle East is not unique in terms of violence. And I say this, what should be self-obvious, because far too much and far too often in the United States, people have this notion that it's a place that has eternally been in conflict. In fact, many of my students, and I suspect many of the students who take these classes, one of the first impressions is that people have been fighting forever. Forever is a very long time, as we should know. And in fact, people in the Middle East have not been fighting forever. Most people have an ahistorical understanding of the conflict. And by ahistorical, I mean two things. One is they think it's been going on forever, but that's part of the problem. The other part is that it's ahistorical in the sense that they see no real reasons. The reasons seem to elude them. And as such, when we don't understand the reasons, then obviously we cannot come up with a solution. And so very often, part of the problem with the conflict resolution in the Middle East is that the reasons behind the conflict are either misconstrued or misunderstood, or at least, if nothing else, understood partially. So what is it that brought us to this point, this really radical point? And I would like to argue that what has brought us to this point are three factors, the confluence of three factors. One is failed states. Two, it's the imperial fantasies of the United States and to a certain extent Israel. And I'll explain what I mean by imperial in a bit. And third, it's the rise of violent visionaries who have basically come to exploit this unhappy and unstable political landscape. So I will briefly address each one of those before I sort of bring them all together. The last time that I recall, there was a moment in which we had a political leader in the Middle East that presented hope, opportunities, and a vision, a real vision for the Middle East. It was with Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, it seemed that moment that the Arab phoenix will rise. And in fact, that's the kind of language he spoke about. He talked about how the illiterate would be educated, the poor will become wealthy, and the ill will become healthy. And the Arabs will finally take their place, rightful place, in the world stage. So in the 50s and the 60s, it appeared it was a moment of hope. People were absolutely elated that this was the moment of pan-Arabism, the idea that all the Arabs will come together in this incredibly powerful moment and a very positive moment, and they will enter into the civilizational history records. Unfortunately, the dream very quickly turned into a nightmare. And the reasons for that is quite simply that we turned from a state that promised a whole lot to a state that became what we come to know as mukhabarat state, security agency state, security apparatus. So the Middle East, the promises of the Middle East completely floundered. And 1967, if 56 was the moment where everybody had great hopes, 67 was the moment where everybody lost that hope. At least hope in the sense that the state is going to bring to them some great and bright future. So rather than have democratic states that fulfill the dreams, the desires, the hopes of the people that they ruled over, what we end up with are states that rule over the people through violence. And increasingly, more and more through violence. The more these states lost legitimacy, the more violent they became. Nasser was the first iteration, but then we, of course, have al-Assad regime in Syria, and then, of course, we have Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So ultimately, then, one of the elements that emerges by the end of the 1990s is that the Middle East as a whole, overall, was ruled by a group of rulers, really, that were completely dissociated from the population, had no interest in fulfilling their hopes, and ultimately suppressed and repressed them. And so that left the great majority of people living in the Middle East, Arab and non-Arab alike, feeling hopeless, completely without any direction. And if anybody needed, if you will, evidence for the bankruptcy of these regimes, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War of 1991, came to be that. Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Arab League, which for a long time people joked about as nothing but a paper tiger, proved itself to be even not a paper tiger at all, more like a paper cricket. And the fact of the matter is, it appeared unable and unwilling, perhaps, to solve the problem itself. And it turned out that we had a big fight with the United States sending close to about 500,000 troops. And the notion of pan-Arabism died. The notion that the region itself can solve its problems died. And ultimately, we had nothing left. Now, this brings me to another point. The United States has always been involved in the Middle East. It didn't start with 9/11. I think there's sort of, to a certain extent, historical amnesia. The United States has been involved in the Middle East for a very, very long time. Beginning with the King Crane Commission that we sent around World War I, then with FDR's meeting with King Saud of Saudi Arabia, and ultimately go on from there for every element. Our relationship with Israel, the American troops in Lebanon in 1956 and 1982, the Gulf War obviously is another example, our involvement in the CIA, a plot that overthrew Mossadegh in Iran. I say all of these things, this historical list, to make a very simple point. We have been involved in the daily lives of people in the region. We have not been the innocent Americans abroad. I don't mean to imply by this that it's our fault, their fault. That kind of logic is really ridiculous, and it minimizes the complexity of the situation. The point I'm trying to make is that we have influenced how people live. And in many ways, we have contributed sometimes positively and sometimes negatively. The negative part has been that we have, before the 1990s, we have been, if you will, a stumbling block to the rise of self-ruling people, because our interest has been very simply oil. Anything to do with oil, anything that fulfilled our reach for oil, anything that maintained our control of oil was something that we considered positive, even if it meant supporting regimes that are not necessarily democratic, such as Saudi Arabia or Egypt. So our involvement has not always been a very positive involvement. And that's very unfortunate, by the way, because in 1920, when the King Crane Commission went there, and they were asking people who you would like to be the mandate power, that is, the power that will rule over the Middle East, at least temporarily, over 70% of the population said the United States. Today, I suspect that if you go take a poll, that it would not be the case at all. We have come to replace, unfortunately, France and Britain as the imperial power in the Middle East, and not in a positive sense, more so. Now, in the last 6 years, things have even gotten worse. And the reason is because there emerged within the United States a group of individuals, you probably can have heard of them, they're called the neocons, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Cheney, and various other people like that, who came to believe that the old policies of the United States vis-a-vis the Middle East is completely a failure. And to a certain extent, they're absolutely right. They believe that the United States has an obligation to be a moral country. And again, I think that's a sentiment we all agree with. They believe that the United States should not shy away from saying this is wrong and this is right and you should do what's right. And again, that's all fine and everything. The problem is the following. They believed also that in order to implement their vision of a moral America that guides the world unilaterally, we have to use our military. In fact, they believed very strongly that after the Vietnam War, we should be not retreating from a strong military, but in fact we should be reinforcing the military and broadcasting our power overseas through that military. So in essence then, although there are principles, which is that you cannot coddle authoritarian regimes, and furthermore that you must stand for liberty, democracy, freedom, human rights, and all the things that what is positive about this country, that are positive about this country, they believe that the way to do it is militarily. And part of that is imperial hubris. And the idea is quite simply that because we are able to simply broadcast our power through our very oppressive military, which I don't think there's a single country in the world can compete against it, we should do it. It was no longer a question of when is it proper to use the military. It was no longer a question of should we use the military to achieve certain goals, but rather is we will use it and when do we use it? At what moment? And obviously 9/11 provided a very important opportunity. The planning for 9/11, what came after 9/11, that is the invasion of Iraq, had nothing to do with 9/11 per se. We know the story. I don't want to go into that. There's many more important things. But the people who actually came to shape American policy were thinking about Iraq as early as the 1980s. Wolfowitz, who was one of the key architects and who drafted the very interesting plan for the Pentagon in the 1980s, was very much believing that we have to have regime change. So in some ways then, what becomes very dramatically different over the past 6 years is that the American foreign policy was changed dramatic in a different direction. Specifically, we have preemptive concept. That is, we go in and we change regimes. We do not wait for these regimes to emerge and become, problematic for us. Rather, we change them ahead of time. And this was, of course, a post-Cold War, so we no longer worry about the Soviet Union. Now we worry about regional powers, Iraq being one of them. So that change, all of a sudden, broadcasts, if you will, American power in a way that was unprecedented. While in the First Gulf War, we had a coalition of troops that went in and indeed ejected Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, we stopped. And that is, we stopped because the mandate was, you kick him out of Kuwait and we stop. Here, it was a very different story. The idea was simply, we are going to change the regimes. And we did. And for a moment, it appeared to be successful. There was almost, celebrations, but that moment was very fleeting, as we have come to see. The death and destruction and the amount of violence that has claimed the lives of our servicemen and women, as well as the lives of many, many Iraqis, and the numbers people are arguing over them, it's irrelevant, has really been distressful. But more importantly than that, the problems in Iraq has simply spread to the rest of the Middle East, which is something that people anticipated even before the invasion. It is not so much that Iraq itself is a disaster zone, and it is. It's a civil war by any definition. It is a country in which the central state is fraught with corruption, and it's ready to collapse. And now there's beginning to be serious discussions within the U.S. administration about dividing up Iraq into small states, 3 states to be exact, and that would be very disastrous for the region from my perspective. But it's not only that. It's not only that Iraq is a problem, but actually Iraq itself has become a problem for the rest of the region. it has created serious ramifications, a ripple effect, if you will, for the rest of the Middle East as a whole. And so part of the problem that we find then is the following. We have failed states that are completely incapable of doing anything but suppressing their own population. And certainly they are not capable of solving regional problems in the Middle East. And instead, what we have is that the United States has entered as a key player there, as a very imperial force there, that has in essence militarized the region far more than ever before, and has created a wave of violence that has not only shaken Iraq, but the rest of the region. In this kind of climate, in which the state, the local indigenous state, has failed, and in which a very obviously imperial power, from the perspective of the people living in the region anyway, is present, there has emerged a group of what you will call violent visionaries. These are Hamas, Hezbollah, and various other organizations. These are not Al-Qaeda, although Al-Qaeda has similarities to them, but they are very interesting. If you look at these jihadi groups, as they have come to be called, and they're not all jihadi groups, but we'll use that term for now. If you look at them, they have emerged in the three failed states, the most failed states, where the central state does not exist. I'm sure you already know them. Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine. In all three areas, what you have seen is a rise of more radical groups. And the question is why? Why do we see the radicalization of politics that has emerged? Why all of a sudden do we find people that are willing to die in the most horrendous fashion in order to bring violence and death to other people around them? What is it about it? Now, people have come up with very interesting answers, and I think most of these answers really miss the point. Some people have claimed something to do with 70 virgins in heaven. Some people have argued it's something to do with $5,000 payment for the family. Some people have even considered that there's something dysfunctional about Islam itself that leads people to such violence. And I've even heard one person who somehow thinks it's genetically coded into Middle Easterners to be born of their mother's womb with a bomb in their hands and saying, "Death to America." That kind of nonsense, all of these things, they have kernels of truth, of course, aside the genetic side part. As I can attest to, I didn't have a bomb in my hand when I was born. But the fact of the matter is, they are really of limited utility in explanation. Every religion has the capacity for violence. Every group of human beings on earth have the capacity for violence. For heaven's sake, if Buddhists can have a fundamentalist regime, then any other religions in my mind can have a fundamentalist regime, right? I mean, this is Buddhism. So the fact of the matter is, it is not unique to the region. It is not unique to Islam. What it is these movements have arisen amidst a reservoir of frustration. They feed off this reservoir. They are movements who basically emerge to provide people with hope, with opportunity, and with dignity in a way that neither the failed states did, nor the United States appears to be doing. They provide them with a model that appears to be organic, part of their lives, and it is not imported. It is not the quote-unquote sort of Western model, and it's not, obviously, the now defunct Eastern model. It is now the third way Islam. It's a language that people understand, but it's not just words. This is the power of these groups. And whether one likes them or not is not the issue here. The question is, how did they become so successful? And we have very many examples. You go to Cairo, Shubra is one of the poorest neighborhoods in Cairo. It's a place where the state never even bothered bringing clean water and electricity, let alone health clinics and a real proper education. Muslim Brotherhood, which is the most organized, most powerful political party in Egypt today, stepped in. It stepped in the early 80s. It brought in tankers with water. It actually set up health clinics. One could sort of say, where are they getting their money with these guys? One could ask all sorts of valid questions. But on the receiving end, the people who are receiving the clean water and the health clinics are thankful. And then it's not a very far step from that point to the point where these people begin to feel that the Muslim Brotherhood represents them. It's an organization that actually cares about them. And again, one can take issue from this point of view. We can say this is manipulation. This is populist politics. That is all very true. But the end result is people actually do benefit. In Lebanon, I'll give you an example. And as I'm sure you've read, the minute the bullets stopped flying and the rockets stopped flying in Lebanon, the same individuals in Hezbollah who were carrying AK-47s and anti-tank missile rocket launchers put them down and picked up basically a pen and a paper and went around to the people and said, what do you need? Do you need water? Do you need medicine? Do you need a house? Do you need furniture? Do you need a new car? Do you need a job? And they actually came through. Now, of course, the money is coming from Iran. Of course, this is not surprising. It's Iranian money that's made off of sale of oils because we consume a lot of oil in this country and the rest of the world. That is all very true. But they did it. To this day, the Lebanese central government seems to be incapable of actually beginning the process of taking the billions of dollars that have been promised to the central state and actually distributing them to people in need. It hasn't happened. Rather, political quibbling seems to basically paralyze the state. So the point I'm trying to make is that these organizations, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, satisfy the people at various levels. One, at a very practical day-to-day level. They give them what they want. But another one, they have come to replace the Nasser era regime of pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism, the idea of Arab nationalism, is dead. Nobody seems to buy it anymore. Even the most hardened, pan-Arabists no longer talk about it. But these guys, the leaders such as Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, or the leaders of Hania or Khalid Mash'al from Hamas, they actually are giving not people just food and drink and water and health clinics. They're actually giving them some vision. Now, to us, it may appear that it's a very violent vision. And of course, it has violent aspects to it. But that's not what really appeals to people. It is a sense of dignity that is embedded in that vision. That is what's so dangerous about it in some ways. It is not that they're telling them we're going to destroy the enemy. That's not it. But it's giving them a sense of pride that people in the region seem to have lost in the waves of violence that have been visited upon them over and over again. So this is why we are at this point. This is why we do not seem to be able to move forward. This summer was a test in Lebanon. It was an attempt on the part of Iran to make a statement to the United States about nuclear issue, and it was an attempt on the part of Israel to make a statement to Iran by destroying Hezbollah. Both of them failed. And in essence, we are back to where we started. We are back to the stalemate of violence that I alluded to at the beginning. So the question is, how do we break out of this? Is there any possibility, any hope for this region? All right, if you give me $5, I'll tell you. I'm just kidding. They're all writing intently all of a sudden.
Take up the collection.
Yeah, take up collection. Sorry. There are three solutions, really. Always come in three. Do you notice that? Never four. It's like the holy grenade. For those of you laughing, obviously you watch Monty Python. All right, so first, there's a political solution. And the solution is very much not what the United States has been exercising. And by the way, please don't take this that I am opposed to the current administration or for the current administration. This is simply a critique of how we can move forward. The current administration's approach has been that the domino theory works this way. If Iraq becomes democratic, the rest of the Middle East becomes democratic. In other words, they believe the solution to the region will derive from the Middle East. In fact, they're absolutely wrong. It's the other way around. The solution to Iraq derives from the region. And there are specific issues that need to be dealt with, and I'll allude to them. If you take public opinion polls, if you go to Zughbi International Polling, which has made a name for itself for doing polling in the Middle East over and over again, you will find that over and over and over again, in every poll that we have seen, it shows that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is the first issue on people's mind. On the eve of the invasion of Iraq, when people in the Middle East, including Kuwait, by the way, the neighbor of Iraq, were asked, who do you consider to be the most threatening element? It was not Saddam Hussein. It was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We have to solve it. I don't have a whole time to tell you how to solve it, but we actually do know it. Questions and answers, I'm not trying to, sidestep the issue. But I can answer it, but we don't have much time for it. But we have to solve it. We have to engage in a way that we have not been engaged for the last 6 years, in which we have allowed this conflict to fester. And it really has come to bite us over and over again. It's not a conflict just about Palestinians and Israelis. And by the way, Israelis themselves in polls show that this resolution of this conflict is very critical. It's not just the Arab populations. So the fact is we have to go in and solve this issue. And we know we have a blueprint, believe it or not. It takes political will. That's one. Two, Iran. Our dealings with Iran have been incredibly problematic. We have sought to isolate Iran. And ironically speaking, Iran perhaps is the one hope for the Middle East. Iran is a Janus of a nation. On one hand, it is the past of the Middle East. On the other, it's the future of the Middle East. It is the past of authoritarian mullahs who are dictating to their population how they should live. But at the same time, Iran holds the potential for truly democratic nations in a way that no other nation in the Middle East I see has been practicing. Whether it's in terms of elections, whether in terms of turnout, in terms of youth, in terms of opposition newspapers, so on and so forth. The list goes on. Iran holds hope for the Middle East for creating a local democracy. Whether it will succeed or not is not something that we can foretell, but it's a potential. Our dealings with Iran has been to isolate it. We have sought to completely isolate Iran, specifically by focusing on the nuclear issue, which is a valid issue, by the way. Let me state it very frankly. Iran does not have the right to have a nuclear weapon. Nobody in the Middle East, including Israel, should have a nuclear weapon. That's straightforward. We have enough weapons in the Middle East, really. I mean, we don't need any more. How much more can we kill each other, right? So the fact of the matter is nobody should have a nuclear weapon in the Middle East, and certainly Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. They don't need it. Should they have nuclear technology? Peaceful? That's a different discussion. But the way we've approached it is we've simply created an ultimatum. And creating ultimatums for regimes such as Iran completely ignores history. It ignores history of colonialism. When you make ultimatums in the Middle East, you bring up memories for people that we don't have. Memories in which we actually go in the 1950s and overthrow a legitimately elected Iranian government and put in its place the Shah of Iran, who spent another 20 years lording it over his own people. There's people's history and memory in the Middle East, for those of you who've traveled there, no, it's long. They remember these things. So when we create ultimatums, we bring up colonial and imperial histories that they reject. And the knee-jerk reaction is to become, in essence, reactionary. We have to have a carrot and a stick approach to Iran. I know this metaphor has been used by various politicians recently, but it really does work. We do have to have a carrot and a stick. We have to give the Iranians something. And the Iranians have wanted something for a long time. And they've wanted it before the Iranian Revolution of '79. They wanted a role, a regional role in the Middle East. The Iranians have always seen themselves as a regional superpower. To isolate them, to minimize them, is not going to work. Look at Iraq and look at Lebanon. The Iranians have the capacity to make our lives very miserable in the region. And they've done it. They can do it again and again and again. We need them. There is no denying that we need the Iranians. No matter how much we can play this game, the Iranians are necessary for the United States to achieve anything in the region. Therefore, we have to negotiate with the Iranians. We cannot simply say, we're not going to talk to you. It's not going to work. And the Iranians will, as they've shown over and over again, they are willing to talk. They're very smart. They're clever. They're going to try to get around things. That's all true, but that's diplomacy. And ultimately, it's very important to remember, we don't negotiate with friends. We're already friends. I mean, why do you negotiate with friends? You know, I want your taco. It's like, okay, here. That was easy. You negotiate with enemies. I mean, that's the whole premise of diplomacy. We have to negotiate with our worst enemy, and Iran is perhaps our worst enemy in the region. 3, Syria. The Syrian regime is incredibly shaky. But the fact of the matter is the Syrians still can play a spoiler game, as they've done in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And the Syrians want one thing. Their whole foreign policy is predicated on one thing and one thing only, the Golan Heights. If you watch Syrian television, if you look at Syrian newspapers, if you followed Syrian foreign policy makers, they've always insisted on one thing, which is the Golan Heights, which were taken by Israel in the 1967 war. They want them back. They want them back because that is what they have premised the whole regime on. And the Israelis and the Syrians have to start negotiating, and we can actually broker that. So that's a third element in terms of negotiations. Now, all of this is fine and everything, but that's not really going to solve the problem in the Middle East. In the Middle East today, there is a model that transcends all of this. Believe it or not, it does exist. And it's something that's below our radar because the microphones and the cameras do not go there. It's basically the humanistic and the humane side of the Middle East. Yes, it does exist. People are not constantly killing each other in the Middle East. It's a fallacy. For those of us who live there, who travel there, we see it very differently. We see the human kind of people. I mean, they're just decent human beings, some of them. Some of them are jerks, just like us. Right? I mean, we're not all perfect. I don't think yet. Anyway, we're working that way, but not quite there. The fact of the matter is, there is a model for living together. And it's a model, ironically speaking, that has been working quietly since the 1980s. It's the rise of, in essence, a regional middle class. It's a middle class that is comfortable in Beirut, in Cairo, in Dubai. It's comfortable even in Tel Aviv. They have the same taste in music, bad. And they have the same taste in food, good. And they are professionals. They jet set around the Middle East. They speak half English, half Arabic. Some of them even speak, 1/3 French, 1/3 Arabic, and 1/3 English. And they actually talk to each other. For example, one of the most popular singers in Israel is a Lebanese singer, not because of her voice, but because of her shape. One of the most popular singers in Saudi Arabia is Israeli, because she sings with a voice that sounds like Kulthum, which was the most famous Arabic singer in the Middle East. These things are happening. People watch TV, the same shows, bad most of them. Reality shows are really very popular in the Middle East these days, right, as they are here. And so on and so forth. What I'm saying here is that we see the rise of a new middle class. A middle class that is not ideological. And that's what's so interesting about them. It's a middle class that's more interested in a good life. Of course, there are some negative aspects to that, which is that they are not committed to any real causes. But at the same time, they're not the ideologues. They're not the visionaries. They don't believe that there's a single ideology that has to be imposed on everybody. And they are creating a model in which people can coexist. And they live it on a day-to-day basis. There is a weakness to this model. 2 weaknesses. And will be the next part of why I think how we can solve the problem in the Middle East, and I promise I'll shut up after that. One weakness is that this model is dissociated from the reality of most people's lives. Although they themselves as a group, this middle class group that I'm talking about, this regional middle class, that crosses boundaries very easily, that does not believe in nationalism, that does not believe in Arabism, that does not believe in an Islamic fundamentalist movement, this group is too limited. They are dissociated from the reality of most people around them. They live a very nice life, but they don't know how the majority of Arabs and non-Arabs live in the Middle East. And as I'm sure you all know, most people in the Middle East are not wealthy. They're poor. I'll give you some statistics. In Gaza, the average income of a family is $600 a year. Right? That's a year. Israel, just across the border, is $26,000 a year. In Egypt, the average income is about $4,300 a year. Unemployment, if you take for the age from 15 to 25, male, it's 35%. That's a lot of young men with university diplomas that are very frustrated with nowhere to go. So the fact of the matter is we have a large underclass in the Middle East. It's this underclass that in essence feeds into the more radical organizations because they have no other outlets. The state has failed them and the global economy seems to be failing them. In fact, if anything, seems to be rubbing in their faces the fact that they are losers with a capital L. This is the group that has been abandoned. And the Arab world and the Middle East in general is growing younger by the day. It's a very young population. And this is a group that's going to just get bigger. So this is a group we have to target, not just politically, but actually economically. And that's what's been missing so often from the discussions. To give people a reason not to become enamored and involved and perhaps active participants in violent organizations, you have to give them a different vision, something to hope for. And that's why we should have a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. The Middle East does need, more than at any time, a Marshall Plan. And it's not one that has to be funded by the United States. In fact, it's preferable if the United States does not fund it, because all of a sudden it becomes tainted money. There are enough wealthy nations in the region, and enough nations that are very concerned with the way politics are going, that they could be pressured to provide money, that they should be involved in creating a fund to invest in new types of jobs, a new economy for the Middle East. Not just sort of the global economy that hires 10,000 people and then leaves 1 million unemployed, but one that actually invests in a way that brings most of these people in. A plan, if you will, a fund that invests in a new type of education, which has been very much missing in the Middle East, at 2 levels. An education that actually functions. If you go to Egyptian classrooms, it's a nightmare. Some of you may think our classrooms are a nightmare. You haven't even been in an Egyptian classroom. You don't even know the word nightmare. We're talking about 50 people per class, and this is a holding pen for cattle, not for children. It's not an educational system. And the second problem with the educational systems is they have been constructed by states who are interested in indoctrinating their population to say, yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's it. So we need a new educational system in the Middle East. And in this instance, the United States has been involved through NGOs, but we can be involved a lot more. So the point I'm trying to make here, and again, we can go into details later because I see the time is beginning to creep up on us. We cannot simply deal with issues of politics. Politics are important. But what is also missing is this incredible notion that we have to have, the Middle East needs an economic revival. And the third element is that we have to go beyond the clash of civilization model. We can no longer afford to play this game of clash of civilization because it becomes a self-fulfilling, self-defeating prophecy. If we keep saying the Muslim world and the Western world are bound to clash, first of all, it completely negates and ignores history, which really pains me as a historian. It makes me completely useless. But more importantly, it really becomes self-fulfilling, as we see repeatedly, as we see with the waves of anger that keep rising every time some person makes a statement about Islam or the Prophet Muhammad or what have you. We have to go beyond that model. We actually have models historically as well as contemporaneously in which people do exist. It has nothing to do with their sense of identity, whether they are Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or Muslim. It has to do with their identity as a human being. People can circumvent these things. So, politically, we have to be involved to actually enter into negotiations. And I'm not naive. I'm not saying we must not keep a stick handy, but we really cannot play the role. We cannot afford it, and we have failed at it anyway, of being the imperial policeman of the world. It's not successful. 2, economically, we have to be involved as well. We have to actually transform the region into a productive region. And 3, we have to create a cultural dialogue, not a clash of civilization. And if we do all of these things, I don't know what will happen in the Middle East. I'm not going to promise you there's going to be peace. They're not all going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, I'm sure. There's going to be a lot of bad blood. It's not going to go away quickly. But it certainly is going to be at least a new approach that hopefully will take us in a different direction. At least we should give that a try. Thank you so much.
Let's just go ahead and start with questions.
Yes, sir? Oh. All right.
Do you believe Iraq can be used as
Hold
a...
on 1 second. Sorry, we're recording this. And we have
Do you believe... Do you believe Iraq can be used as a tool to accomplish these objectives that you've listed?
Not at this moment, no. I think Iraq is too far gone by now. To a certain extent, the United States' role in Iraq has become counterproductive. And I say that because we have established a history in Iraq. And it's a history that has not been a laudable history from the point of view of the people on the receiving end, for the most part. There's no doubt that we've done some positive things, but overall, at this point, our presence only compounds the problem. Do you want to follow up on the question?
Well, I agree. I mean, if we're declaring a war on terrorism, then the only thing to solve that would be a treaty to end terrorism. But you can't. Who are you going to sign with? So as long as we're there fighting, it's going to get worse. So do you think we should just get out? Or where do we go from here?
Well, I don't think we should just simply pack up tomorrow and leave, because that is in essence going to create a very serious vacuum. The first step is really to talk to the people who do hold some keys to power in Iraq, and that is the Iranians. The Iranians have a fairly strong interest in Iraq. They do not want to see dismembered Iraq. They cannot afford to see dismembered Iraq, because that will create problems for the Kurdish population in Iran itself, and of course it will create an unstable situation on their border. So the Iranians themselves have been playing this game. They want to make our lives miserable in Iran, but they don't want it to make it so miserable as to make us go out real quickly or to make Iraq fall apart. I mean, so to their benefit, the longer we're there, the happier they are, as long as they're left alone. I think if Iran is brought into the negotiating table, they could be, in essence, shifted from people that have been playing a fairly negative role in Iraq to playing, I think, a more positive role. It's only when you do that, and also when you solve those other problems, that you can start taking steps to leave Iraq. Right now, it would be fairly complicated. Now, does that mean that Iraq is going to enter in civil war the minute anytime we leave? It's possible. I think Iraq is in the midst of a civil war. I mean, I'm not quite sure what people are waiting for to use that term. The numbers are horrific. The level of violence, at least from my perspective as a person who grew up and lived through the Lebanese civil war, strikes me as just equal to Lebanon. So Iraq is in shambles. And to a certain extent, we have to do things. One is we have to stabilize the surrounding areas to stop people interfering negatively. And two, we have to actually allow the Iraqis to decide their own future. We cannot. We have proven ourselves incapable of doing anything about it. Not for lack of intelligence, not lack of resources, but because building nations is very complicated. And we have failed at it in this instance. And the reality is the Iraqis will have to decide what their future is. Is it going to be dismemberment? It's up to them. It's not up to us anymore, I think. Yes, sir.
I lived in Lebanon during the Civil War, the same time that they're talking about. And I found it to be much more peaceful, than most. And we had good times in Lebanon. I was there when the embassy was hit.
Mm-hmm.
I was there when the Marines were hit.
Mm-hmm.
I was a teacher at AUB, and the president was assassinated while we were there. But people were happy. And people in Iraq were happy too. I've talked to Iraqis who live there, and most of Iraq is stable. I mean, it's Baghdad and Anbar province where most of the fighting, the trouble is going on. And most of the Iraqis like our presence there. They don't look at us as an occupier in the same sense as Russia or France or Britain. So I think that we can build on the democracy, I think, in Iraq. People voted at much larger majorities than we have.
Okay. I'll repeat the question for the interest. There are two comments that were made. One is that people in Lebanon during the Civil War were happy, even though there was a great deal of violence. I'll come back to that. And the second point I think you were making is that I perhaps paint too dark a picture of Iraqi response to us. And I'll respond to these 2 points separately. Of course, I lived through the Lebanese Civil War, so I kind of relate to a certain extent to what you're saying, that people were happy. People living in civil wars do the best they can to live. They live in a very bizarre circumstance in which they see, they may be going to buy a loaf of bread, then they see somebody getting shot in front of them. So the notion of happiness that you're alluding to was perhaps for a small group of people that weren't seeing this on a day-to-day basis, according to my experience that I lived with it. And the happiness was fake. And I can tell you why it's fake. Because today, the number of people visiting psychiatrists in Lebanon is just skyrocketed. The impact of the psychological impact of the Lebanese civil war on the Lebanese has been very dramatic, far more dramatic after the war. And this is not unusual for Lebanon. During the conflict, people tend to hold together. They hold on to the dearest thing. And I'll just tell you a short story to indicate how bizarre it was and how normalcy and happiness become relative. One day I was leaving our house, which was right on the front lines, and I was going up. My mother had sent me to get some bread. And to go up there, we had to go up this one road, and you pass an opening in the road that opens up to an alley. We used to call it Sniper Alley because there was a sniper not too far down the road who would just shoot at people as they crossed. And in fact, there were barrels full of sand, and there was in Arabic, intabih qannas, beware sniper. All right? Normal. I mean, this is just like, it's like, and we had. I'm sure you remember the signs that says no tank crossing. Did you ever see that sign? We had no tank crossing on some roads. This kind of normalcy that exists. But anyway, at that day, I was there, and there was an old woman there that was ahead of me, and I just waited as she was crossing. And she did this very strange ballet with death, so to speak. She tucked and rolled and jumped, and because you can't just walk, you'll get killed. And then she got to the other side. She got up, brushed herself, went on to her merry way to buy bread. And I stood there, and it hit me. This is weird. I mean, this is not normal human behavior. I mean, I don't know how many of you go to the bread aisle in the supermarket and do a little ballet dance before you get the loaf of bread. But this older woman, which must have been in her 70s, was literally like a soldier doing this. And she was normal in that sense. And so I agree with you, but I think in the moment people try to hold on to any sense of humanity, even if it's insane to a certain extent. It's afterwards when you see the problems. And in fact, Lebanon today is in a very bad situation because of that. Partly because people don't want to deal with the aftershock of the war. So that notion of happiness has to be contextualized, if you will. Now, the second point, which you raised about Iraq, there is no doubt that there are people in Iraq, in fact, I would suspect the majority, who are absolutely happy that Saddam Hussein is gone. However, if you look at the polling, again, and that's the way to go beyond anecdotes, because I'm sure you will find somebody who is benefiting, somebody who is happy, somebody simply who just is a happy human being who says, it's okay, as a bomb explodes next to them. But the fact is, generally speaking, if you look at the polling, you find that Iraqis put America below Saddam Hussein. There's a recent poll that came out of Baghdad, I think it came out about 4 weeks ago, that said list the worst, the most dangerous, or the person you like the least, if you will. And the United States was liked less than Saddam Hussein. That is a very dangerous situation for us to be in, because it is in essence telling us that we are getting ranked with probably one of the most brutal totalitarian ruler in the region. And that's not a good place to be in that sense. So I would beg to disagree on that point, in that regard. Back there, sir?
Well, I was just talking with some people back here, and we're kind of wondering what type of polling is being used. Is it phone polls? And if so, I mean, is that kind of limited?
It's not phone polling, no.
Well, like how, can you tell us more how it is being conducted
in
what regions? And
sure. The Zughbi poll that was taken regional-wide, it was subcontracted to small organizations within each country. So you had somebody in Egypt, somebody in Kuwait, somebody in Lebanon, Tunisia, what have you. And what they would do is they would basically send people out with a clipboard. And this was man-on-the-street kind of interview. And this is the polling was sampling off the street. And it was scientific polling in the sense that they actually wanted to look as cross-current. In Iraq, the polling is done with a notion about whether you're Kurd, Sunni, Arab, Shia or not, male, female, age group, educational. So in fact, they were looking at a cross-section. And the sampling, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert by any way, but Zughbi, if you go to their website, they'll give you the full details. It's a full scientific sampling. In other words, they try to get as large a cross-section of the population as they can. There's a question all the way up front. You're going to get your exercise today.
I'm just wondering if there are any large-scale political players currently in the United States that share your viewpoint.
No. There's a great deal of dissatisfaction with the war in Iraq, but clearly nobody's coming up with new ideas. We have entered into cul-de-sac policy, basically. We all are facing this situation, and we have no idea how to get out. Neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party are coming up with answers. Now, as you very well know, recently there was a commission that was commissioned by the Congress and headed by Jim Baker. and it has variety. It's supposed to be a bipartisan commission. That it is in essence, and this is fairly common in the tradition of political problems, when administrations face political problems, they always have a commission that tries to solve it for them. And this is one of them. It's trying to come up with a solution of how to extricate ourselves from Iraq without appearing to either cut a run or stay the course. The two sort of, if you will, monikers that we have come to use to indicate two different policies. But overall, I don't think anybody has come up with any ideas. Now, the Jim Baker Commission, to give it that name, is beginning to, according to some English newspapers anyway, we haven't heard reports about it here, is thinking about taking up the Joseph Biden idea, which is to divide up Iraq. Joseph Biden came up on TV and NPR, all the talk shows, and he's basically promoting the idea that we should divide it into 3 provinces, as it was before 1920s when the British combined it together, and the notion we would have a Kurdish north, a Sunni center, and a Shia south. And the Baker Commission is beginning to consider that as a possibility. The problem with that is that it simplifies the complexity of Iraq. Because although we talk about a Kurdish north, in fact, in the north, there are Arabs, there are Turkomans, there are Shia, there are lots of people. And the same thing with the Shia. The other problem also is that the notion that if you're Shia, that's your only sense of identity, when in fact there are all sorts of bifurcations that divide the Shia. So in itself, although it appears appealing to say, okay, Shia south and a Kurdish north, it doesn't work in reality, especially in the cities, which are much more complex. Now, there's ethnic cleansing going on in the sense that people, through particular type of killing of people, are scaring people to go into Sunni area or Shia area, but it's still not there. And the other problem is that notion of beginning to subdivide Iraq will create a serious problem for the rest of the Middle East, because every country in the Middle East is that complex. So all of a sudden, people in Syria are going to say, hey, I want to have a Kurdish part. In Turkey, I'd like the Kurd, There's a big issue there in Iran. So it could lead to a serious notion of subdividing it, and it's not going to resolve the problems because we assume somehow that ethnic nationalism is better than complex nationalism. It's not. Ethnic nationalism could be as problematic as anything else. We've seen it historically. So that solution that is being promoted, I don't think is really going to work. But ultimately, obviously, as I said, nobody is listening to me, so it doesn't matter. Yes, sir.
Why do you feel that Iran is the solution? I mean, what's the main reason for it to be Iran?
Iran is a solution for various reasons. One is that Iran is one of the most populous and powerful countries in the Middle East today. With the collapse of Iraq, there's really no, if you will, bulwark against Iranian power. And so the Iranians, really, outside Israel, are the most powerful element. Two, the Iranians' relationship with the Shia of the Middle East. Not so much that, and I think that's a sort of a bit of a misunderstanding. It's not to say that the Shia in Lebanon, say, or Shia in Iraq are clients of Iran, but there's a very intimate relationship. And it's an intimate relationship that derives very simply from the fact, such as the Shia, the leadership in Iraq, lived in Iran for a long time, some of them over 30 years, and they've had a relationship with that. So there's a political connection there in that regard. Three, Iran is very rich these days, again, thanks to oil, and it is throwing its money effectively in that regard. And so for these variety of reasons, I think Iran is very essential to the solution of any problem in the Middle East. You cannot ignore Iran. It's like the 800-pound gorilla. You're just sitting there, and you can go around it, you can do whatever you want, it will be there. And so, but there's something more positive about Iran, I think. It's not only what Iran can do to negatively affect the Middle East, but Iran also can provide a model for creating a local democracy. One of the notions, one of the problems that has emerged with the word democracy, it has become too closely allied with the idea of an imperial imposition of democracy. That is somebody from the outside telling you what to do. As you know from even children, even if you're telling them, some of them, here's candy bar, eat it, kind of thing. It's this kind of imposition that people have a reaction to. And with a vague notion such as democracy, what exactly it means and all these things, and something that seems to be very foreign, being imposed at the edge of a bayonet or at the turret of a tank, doesn't appeal to people. And it's become negative connotation. It has become, in minds of people, a word to indicate nothing more than an attempt by quote-unquote the West to dominate the Middle East, even if it's not really the case. So it's become tainted. But in Iran, that hasn't been the case, primarily because after the overthrow of the Shah, the Iranians had nobody to blame but themselves in some ways. All the excuses that various other regimes can give, this and that, and that's why we cannot vote today because the Americans, there's somebody caught a cold in America, I'm sorry, we can't have elections. That kind of notion, that is gone for Iran. The Iranian Revolution took away, in many ways, most of these excuses, and the Iranians had to turn inwards because of their isolation, and they say, what do we want? What kind of country do we want? And so you've had a tradition, paradoxically speaking, that's a very democratic tradition that is coexistent with a very authoritarian, Supreme Council, Islamic Council. But it's there that you begin to see the hope. And what's interesting is that if you look at news reports about politics and what have you, you find that people in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and in the Middle East, they are reading much more what's going on in Iran than anywhere else. To them, Iran has emerged as a very powerful, negatively and positively, element in their lives. And the Saudis are very concerned about Iran, not only for the power it can export or sort of broadcast, but also because it's providing a model of Islamic democracy. And Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, as we very well know, so it's a problem in that regard. So that's why I said Iran is very important.
We've got time for one more question.
Sir?
You had spoken of a Marshall Plan for the Middle East, and I was just wondering if you had any idea on how to prevent, like a Sudanese government from just taking all the resources away.
Sure. I haven't sat down and worked out the full details yet. I'm working on that. It'll be my next book. No. But you're absolutely right, and that's a very good point. The question is, how do you get the money to the people who actually need it? And the answer is to my mind at least, you have to have two mechanisms. And this is where Europe, Japan, and the United States can play a role, which is a monitoring role of the funding. You have to create a mechanism for distribution of money and accountability. So in other words, for people to get money, they have to have a certain accountability. But generally speaking, more effective, I think, is giving money not so much to the state, but giving money to NGOs. Now, I'm not sort of a romantic fan of NGOs. Many NGOs happen to also be, failures, as any organization. But we have seen a rise of NGOs in the 90s and in the in this 21st century in the Middle East that have been very effective. From women's health clinics to people who are interested in building libraries to environmental groups. Environmental politics is emerging as a very powerful tool in the Middle East to do politics the back way. And so these kinds of organizations are the kind of people you want to start giving money to. Setting up, for example, privatization of education to a certain extent. As not necessarily counterpart to the state, but something that gives the state a little bit better competition in some places. And so these elements, this is where the funding should go, and they're a little bit more accountable. Of course, there's going to be corruption and ineptitude. But as I said, the reality is I wasn't kidding. I really haven't thought out the details, obviously. But it can be done. I mean, it's something that, in essence, has been tried in small ways with the NGOs already. If you look at the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and the monies they give, it's been fairly successful. They've been far more successful than the state agencies. So if you take that and expand it, I suspect that you will have also a greater degree of... so that's what I would say about that. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Thank you so much.